Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to our second episode of History in Our Current World, where we examine the importance of history in foreign affairs and today's world more broadly. Today, we're diving into why a strong understanding of history is so important in our current world. We'll use the book Dangerous Games, The Uses and Misuses of History, as a frame of reference, and we'll look at how, at various times, dictators have told misleading stories about the past, suppressed history in order to hold on to power, and used historical facts to justify their authoritarian control. We'll also dive into a number of other topics. Let's turn now to our conversation with the author of Dangerous Games, Margaret MacMillan.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by Margaret MacMillan, emeritus professor of history at the University of Toronto and an emeritus professor of international history at Oxford University. She was provost of Trinity College, Toronto, from 2002 to 2007, and warden of St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2007 to 2017. She is a trustee of the Imperial War Museum and sits on a number of nonprofit advisory boards. Her research specializes in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her publications have been translated into 26 languages and include Paris 1919, Nixon and Mao, and The War That Ended Peace. Her latest book, published in 2020, is War: How Conflict Shaped Us. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks. I am exceedingly excited about today's episode. As many of our longtime listeners know, I have mentioned dozens of times that I teach a class on history's influence on foreign affairs and love the class. And there's a book in the class I have used every time I've taught the class called Dangerous Games by Margaret MacMillan, where she goes in and provides examples of all the myriad different ways that history is used in our current world, in domestic politics, foreign affairs, all the different things. And Margaret has been kind enough to join us today to chat about that. So, Margaret, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So, one of the first questions I want to ask you is, I can't believe, first of all, that the book is almost 20 years old now, which is kind of surprising to me and shocking. I feel so connected to this book. I've used it so many times and gone back over it time and time again. It seems fairly apparent in today's world why you would write that book. But going back to the mid 2000s, when you first started thinking about this or first started working on the book, what drove you to write that book in the first place?
Well, it was partly because I was asked to give a series of lectures, and they said I could choose whatever I wanted. And I thought I'd reached the stage in my career, I was getting on, and I thought perhaps I should think about what it is I do in history. And I'd been spending quite a lot of time. I think I gave the lectures sometime at the end of the 1990s or maybe 2000s, but I'd been spending quite a lot of time reading about the breakup of Yugoslavia and the conflicts in the Balkans. And it had struck me just how much history was used in those conflicts, how it was used to mobilize, it was used to demonize the other. It was a very important part of what was happening. And so that's really how it started. And I became more and more interested in it as I looked for examples. And you can find examples everywhere. I mean, what has happened, I think, since I wrote the book is that the explosion of the use of history has been extraordinary. And if I were writing it now, I'd probably write something much longer, which probably isn't a good idea. Students would hate it. But I think what's happened since I wrote it is that history has come to take on a sort of authority, as if it's some sort of impartial judge, some sort of gray-haired judge sitting there saying, you're right, you're wrong. How often do we hear people say, history will judge me, or I want to be on the right side of history? And so I think possibly as we've lost faith in other institutions and other elites, we've come to see history as this sort of impartial judge. And I find it really alarming because history isn't that. History is many things, but it's not some sort of judge, and it's definitely not some sort of justification for whatever you want to do.
Yeah, and I want to talk more as we get into this about, how since your book was published in the late 2000s, how the rise of social media and, the alternative facts and the post-truth world that we kind of live in now has changed this in different ways or just maybe accelerated it. You talk about the way that history can be used in so many different ways by different people, different groups. And one of the things we do in the class that I teach is we start with the basics of what is history. And I have them read E.H. Carr. And then before we even get into examples of how policymakers would use it, we talk first about what is history, but then also we dive into myth. And you just talked about Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia, and we spent a lot of time on that in our class last week. But in your mind, what makes history so malleable? Why is it so easily used by different groups? It could be the same exact historical event or moment, but it's used in different ways by different groups for different reasons.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. I mean, I think it's partly that it tells a story, and we like stories. And the sorts of histories that are used to mobilize people, for better or worse, tend to be simple stories. They tend to be stories that have good guys and bad guys. That they're
Yeah.
like the old westerns. You can tell who's good and who's bad by the color of the hat they wear. And I think people find it consoling. And it offers a sort of explanation of who you are, where you came from, and where you might be going. Well, what's owed you? What do you have a right to have? And so I think there's a power in it. And I think perhaps what appeals is that it's like a nice story which is all clear cut, which in fact history isn't.
Right.
And we know that. But I think it's the persuasiveness of that sort of story.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it, as you've noted in your title of your book, dangerous at times too, is this simplification of history and these stories that are more chicken soup for the soul kind of thing, that is black and white, but takes out the nuance of history and all the different factors that are at play in history. And I think that's where you get in trouble when policymaking comes into play, especially when, my class is geared towards foreign policy because I'm at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. So we focus more on history's effect on foreign affairs. But when policymakers are basing their decisions on faulty history, you're starting from a bad position to begin with. But before I get into too much of that, let's talk a little bit about some of the specific examples that you use in your book and then that you've seen since your book was published as well. You've talked about Kosovo a little bit, and I know that's in your book as well, the former Yugoslavia. What are some of the ways that you saw that and drew you towards writing this book with that kind of story?
Well, the story that began to be told by the Serbian nationalists, by Milosevic, for example, who was head of Serbia as Yugoslavia was breaking up, who'd always been a good communist, had staked his career on Marxism as a way of explaining everything. And when Marxism and communism failed at the end of the 1980s, he was left without a sort of underpinning. And so he discovered Serbian nationalism and he went to the famous battlefield of Kosovo, where the Serbs suffered apparently a defeat in 1389 and said this will never happen again. And people cheered and he realized he was onto something. What was happening? There'd always been a Serbian narrative of history. Well, not always, but there had been certainly since the 19th century, as Serbians began to think of having a nation of their own, of breaking away from their Ottoman rulers. And that had been quite a powerful narrative. And it began to be revived very much in the 1980s by a group of intellectuals, by historians who told a story of a Serbia which had always fought on the front lines of Christianity against Islam, a Serbia which was a brave nation among nations, a Serbia that they used the religious analogy. It was a Christ among nations. It had died but would be resurrected. And a lot of this simply wasn't true, or it was very one-sided, but it was very powerful. And it was a time of turmoil. It was a time of change. People didn't know what was happening. And somehow this was very consoling. And so it was used by Serbian national leaders like Milosevic to mobilize people. And it was also used, and this happens so often, to pinpoint those who'd done them down, who were not there, who weren't friendly to them. And so the Croats became an enemy. The Muslims in Bosnia came to be seen as an enemy, even though they were Slavs and they lived alongside their Serbian neighbors for generations. Somehow this began to divide societies up. And it was just the powerful effects of this that led people to want to kill others and seize territory and destroy societies that really struck me. And I began to notice it elsewhere. I mean, you saw the same sort of nationalism being used in other places as well, in India, for example. And so I became very interested in how history feeds into this. It's a very important component of that sort of ultra nationalism.
Yeah, and the Kosovo story in particular, my students just read a book by Paul Cohen last week where he dives into the myth of Kosovo and does a great job of explaining how it comes back from time to time and how it played a role in the 19th century rise of Serbian nationalism. And then again in the 20th century with Milosevic, and how it kept going back to painting this picture of the enemy and this notion of what's owed me. It brought that into play and was ready for the tinderbox that was Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So the Yugoslavia story and the Kosovo story has a foreign policy element to it, obviously, because it brought in other countries and what would be new countries and NATO and everything like that. But there's also domestic issues of history as well that don't necessarily go beyond borders. You talk a lot in your book about education. You have a chapter titled History Wars that talks about the battles we have internally over our own history. And in this, I'm thinking of the Enola Gay controversy that you talked about in your book. But since you wrote the book, there's been a lot talked about Confederate memorials in the United States and everything. So can you talk a little bit about these history wars and what you mean by that?
Well, it's when people claim to have an exclusive interpretation of history, which excludes others or leads to hostility towards others. I think that it becomes so dangerous. And in the case of the Confederate statues, I found that very interesting. I later on read quite a bit about it. And I do think that with memorials, you have to take it case by case. You can't have a blanket rule because it depends when the memorial is put up, by whom, and for what purpose. And what I hadn't realized was a lot of the Confederate War memorials were put up in the 1950s. A lot of them were very new, and they had been put up for a purpose, which was basically to resist civil rights and to show that
Right.
a different story of Southern history. And so I could see why people wanted to remove them. And I could certainly understand why people living under the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe didn't want the statues of Stalin and Lenin. They never asked for them. They were a symbol of subjection. I think the best thing that was done with them was, I'm trying to remember which country it was. Was it Bulgaria, where this slightly eccentric figure created a park, a theme park of all these statues, and children can go and play on them, and they have swings hanging off Lenin's arms. And I thought that is actually quite clever because it doesn't destroy
Yeah.
them, but it makes fun of them. So I think it has to be case by case. I mean, I'm for memorials if they help us want to know more about the past. And I think they can be contextualized and you can put up signs that help to explain what they are. So taking down everything from the past just because you don't like the stories isn't necessarily good. But there are cases where I can see a very good argument for taking things down.
Yeah, I, like you, in the past decade and a half, have really moved my mindset on the statues and memorials and things of that nature to more of a sort of a case by case basis when I dug into it a little bit more. And it's interesting you talk about history as justification for foreign policy. You mentioned the former Soviet statues, and we've seen pushback from Putin and the Kremlin on this differing vision of history coming out of former Soviet spaces, whether it be Ukraine or Estonia or Bulgaria. So Putin's use of history has been more in the forefront of things over the past decade or so. How does that fit into what you talk about in the book, and why is it so important that we understand that as part of his policies, along with somebody like Xi Jinping?
If I were writing the book today, I would certainly have Putin and Xi Jinping in there, both of whom take history very seriously indeed. I mean, Putin, for quite a long time now, has been going to big conferences of history teachers and exhorts them to teach the right sort of history. And I think in their hands, it has become a very powerful tool, both Xi Jinping and Putin's versions of the past. I mean, Xi Jinping now has portrayed himself as the natural heir of Mao. And history is being used to say that we are the right and natural rulers of this very large country. It proves it. And I think they are very conscious of teaching what they see as the right sort of history in the schools. In China, there's been for decades now patriotic education in the schools, where the young are given a very particular view of Chinese history. It's partly the history of humiliation. It's partly the history of China triumphing, but it's taken very, very importantly. And students, I think, have to do history. And the same thing in Russia. Putin, in fact, recently has been promoting an even more patriotic version of history in the schools, and war veterans from Ukraine, including some of the real thugs from the Wagner group, are being brought into schools and telling these little children about the glorious things they've done, not mentioning some of the appalling things they've done in Ukraine and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I think it has become a way of mobilizing people at home, convincing them that what the government is doing is right, and that that government is there because it is the culmination of all this history. But as we've seen in Ukraine, and as we see with China's claims to the South China Seas and to Taiwan, which in my view are based on very, very shaky history indeed. I mean, the South China Seas,
Yeah.
this 9-dash line is fantasy, but
Yeah.
it's powerful and it's used as justification. I mean, Putin, I think, may really believe he's the heir to Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great, and that it is his duty to get back all the Tsarist territory. And he may really believe that Ukraine has never existed as an independent state. I mean, you've probably read the essay he wrote, Russians and Ukrainians are one people. I read the
Yeah.
English translation. Now, if I'd been grading it, because I'm extremely kind and I want to encourage students, I might have given it a D and said, you really need to check your sources more carefully and your evidence isn't very good.
Yeah.
But it's mostly rubbish. But it's powerful. I think it's seen as a justification, but I think it's also a way of mobilizing people at home.
Yeah, and I think what makes it so difficult to push back against as well is that malleability of history. And it muddies the waters. It makes it more difficult to show that that isn't true, because then you have to do all this work to find things to document that, oh, China doesn't own the South China Sea because the 9-dash line is rubbish and
Yeah.
things like that.
And the trouble is the whole issue, of course, of what you trust has got caught up in the general lack of faith in institutions, and also the impact of social media, that you can go on social media and find any number of stories. And how do you tell?
Yeah.
If you're a young person or an old person wants to find out why is there a war in Ukraine, if you go online, you will find everything from the most absurd conspiracy theories that it's all a plot by Zelensky. Russia was invading to save the Ukrainians from this international cabal of criminals, and all of that stuff. You can find that, and you may also find stuff which is more balanced. But how do you tell?
Right.
And I think that's what's worrying. I mean, it's not that there should be only one version of history, but there really is good history and bad history. And how do we show people what good history is like? I mean, it must be a problem you face a lot in your classrooms. I find it too.
Yeah, it's difficult. And one of the things that I emphasize with my students is that because we start with what is history and talking about history and myth and how to discern these different types of things and understanding how history is done, I talk to them about the fact that this is no different than sort of like you trying to get an understanding on social media literacy. Know where your source is coming from, know who's writing it, when are they writing it, what have they written in the past. It's critical thinking skills. Now, I'm lucky enough that, being at Georgetown, most of my students already have these skills, but these are the types of things that I think need to be expanded out to teach better social media literacy to the broader public. But back to the Putin thing, I think history is so important to Putin, not just with his justification for invading Ukraine and getting people behind him, but the way that he uses history to justify his regime as well. Always this continual victimhood, usually at the hands of the West in his reading of history. But you talk about battles over history and history wars. There was some in the 90s, there was some in the early 2000s. But I tend to be more fearful that we are about to see another shift back to a whitewashing of American history, and with the potential undoing of the Department of Education, what that means for U.S. history being taught in the schools. Can you talk a little bit about domestic education in the United States and history's role in it?
Well, domestic education in the US has become yet another of the cultural war zones. And I think a lot of parents were becoming concerned about what they felt their children were being taught. And you got organized groups which became involved politically in trying to look at curricula and trying to bring changes. And now you have a president who, if his attention falls on something, it may not fall on that thing for very long, but as it does, there will be those who are willing to help him do what he wants to do. And he has said we've got to have a patriotic history. We've got to show how great America is, which will lead to a new version of a one-sided history. It'll be triumphalist. Now, I think there has been concern, and I do share some of it. This one-sided view that in Canadian history, for example, that we are an absolutely frightful nation, that we are misogynist, racist, we've always been dreadful, is something that certain school boards have really pushed. We have elected school boards, and usually nobody knows who they are because it's not a big matter. But we have had this, and I think it has laid what's going on in the schools open to criticism. And a lot of the teaching of Canadian history, it varies from province to province because it's a provincial matter, is episodic. And so children will come out, students will come out of primary school and high school knowing episodes, but they won't know the broader context. They won't know how they fit together. They won't know how Canada became a country. They won't know some of the great political upheavals and questions we've dealt with. And that seems to me really a problem.
Yeah.
So I think some of the culture wars have been promoted by those who, with whatever their intentions, have promoted a particularly dark view of history. And I think in the United States, that whole project, the one that the New York Times sponsored, I always forget the date. 1619, that the United States was racist right from the beginning. Every historian of that period, of any reputation who I respect, condemned their use of evidence, said that they'd got it wrong, that it was based on misunderstandings and faulty reasoning. And the New York Times persisted with it. And I think that laid the whole project open to very serious criticism. And you have to be prepared to debate these issues. And I think the New York Times response was, this is the history, this is what we're going to distribute to schools. They made a few cosmetic changes, but I think, the history wars, I think, have been stimulated by both those on the left and the right, if you want to put it in political terms, who want to use history for their own purposes. And history suffers because what we want to do, I think, is teach students that the whole point about history is looking at evidence, questioning, coming up with explanations, and then being prepared to dump those explanations or change them if they're not good enough, if new evidence comes up. And history should be a debate and should help us to understand how we got to where we are. And I worry that it's now been caught up in wars, and we'll end up with, from whatever political aspect it comes, we'll end up with really dumb, narrow-minded histories which promote a particular story and don't teach people to think about the past.
Yeah, and I think that's what I find so usable in all of my history classes, is just getting students to think about the past and think about the different variables at play and the different causes that play and how thoughts change on how things happened over time and everything that you were just explaining. And I think, that gets lost on a broader public because it is harder to explain than simple stories. And it takes longer to explain. You have to think harder about it. And it's just, it takes more pages up to explain that. And when you're writing 1,000-word op-ed, it becomes difficult to provide all that nuance. So I guess that's a good segue to my question about good history and bad history. And you talk about this in your book, but why is it so important then for historians to have this conversation with a broader public?
We need to challenge the stories that are false or one-sided because of the damage those stories can do. We need to challenge Putin's version of history. We need to understand that Ukraine is a nation in progress. It's a nation that has been developing, but it is something. It does exist. There are people who feel themselves to be part of the Ukrainian nation. And that view of Putin's, that Ukrainians are people who've gone astray or criminals and the good ones are really Russian, is nonsense. And I do think it's important that we keep challenging these interpretations because of the damage they can do in the hands of those who want to wield them to do what they want. And the thing about history that it can do, it's like reading a good novel. It can open our minds to possibilities which we hadn't thought of. And when we tend to assume the world we're living in is the world we're living in, it's the way it is, what we do is right or wrong, but there's no other way of doing it. And when you go back and read about a different culture, if you read classical history, if you read Roman history, or if you read Byzantine history, you're confronting a world in which the value system is different. Some things may be the same, may be familiar to us, but a lot isn't. And it opens our mind to the possibilities that there are other ways of doing things, other ways of organizing societies. We may not want to follow the example, but I think opening up our imaginations and making us realize that we're not necessarily in possession of all wisdom and that what we do is not necessarily the best way of doing it, making us aware that there are other ways of doing things. And I can't see that that's ever a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think it's even more important in today's world when, you're thinking about a China US or China West competition, especially with a culture and a background and a history in something like China that's even more alien to Westerners and especially Americans on what that history was, what the culture's like, as opposed to the Western nations that we've dealt with in competitions over the past centuries. One thing I talk to students about is that it's so important to understand those different histories as well. Try to gain an understanding of where those folks that you're in competition with, where they're coming from, right? They're not coming at this from having an American history background or a Western cultural or history background. They have their own personal histories, their own cultural histories, their own national histories. And that's how they're looking at the issues and the problems and the competition. And same thing with when I talk about analogies with students, is that analogies can be very dangerous if not used properly. And I see them as more of a tool to understand your current moment in better terms than actually something that's going to provide you with what to do moving forward. What's your take on the use of analogies? Because we know it happens, right? Our brains are hardwired to automatically try to find something to comfort us and give us direction.
Yeah, no, I think analogies are useful, but they can be a trap. And you saw it, I think. There's that very good book, which I read with great interest and used in my book by Yuen Fung Kong, called Analogies at War. And it shows exactly what can go wrong if you get trapped in an analogy. This
Right.
is just like, appeasement. We mustn't appease the communists. We must fight them. Look what happened in the 1930s when Britain and France and US didn't stand up to the dictators. We're not going to be like that. And I think there was one person in the State Department who, I think, was it George Ball, who said, there is
Yeah, George
another
Ball.
analysis, another analogy here. And that's what happened to the French in Indochina. And the view was dismissed. Oh, well, that was the French. We won't make those mistakes. Yes, but you did make those mistakes, and you did come up against some of the same things the French came up against in fighting an unpopular war in a far off place. I agree with you completely. Analogies, the world is complicated. We have to find ways of simplifying it. But I do think they're really dangerous. It's handled with care. It really is. And just to go back to your point about memory and understanding others, I always say to my students, it's like dealing with individuals. They're remembering different things from you,
Right.
and they've been shaped by different experiences. And when you get to know them better, you may understand more about them if you know something of that. If they had a difficult life or a complicated life, it helps to explain why they are the way today. And I think we need to know what it is the Chinese are remembering, as they need to know what it is the United States and other Western countries are remembering.
Yeah, I used an article in my class later in the semester about, everybody talks about the US China competition and talks about Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. And there's a great article from War on the Rocks from a few years ago by someone that says, the Chinese have their own classics that we should be studying and looking at, because that's probably what they're looking at when trying to think about the broader geopolitical competition between the US and China. And to your point on the Kong book, I use that for class, and I think it's great for a number of reasons. But I think the one thing I point out to my students when talking about that specific George Ball example is that he used the right analogy, but his detractors that were dismissing it were able to dismiss it with more ease because he had not looked at the analogy at the right time, right? So he was looking at the French in 1954 when they were defeated and on their way out, as opposed to the US in 1964 when they had the backing of the public and looked strong. Whereas he should have been looking at the French in 1946, 47, when they went back into Indochina and could show, look, they have all the same numbers that we have right now. So it's not just picking the right analogy and interrogating it, but like looking at the right analogy at the right time. I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more on today's world and the use of history that we see so much more since you've written the book, and how that would affect what you would maybe write about today if you were to rewrite this book.
Well, I certainly would use more examples of governments and their opponents deliberately using history, and that it becoming part of campaigns. I mean, I was in England during the campaign over the Brexit referendum, and
Yeah,
the
I was going to ask you about Brexit. Yeah,
were you? Yeah,
yeah,
well, the Leave side used history very, very effectively, and the Remain side didn't. I mean, the Remain side tried to appeal to voters' self-interest and rationality. So they said things like, "If we leave, you will be, £2 a week worse off, and this will cost this much more." What the Leave people did was they pulled on the heartstrings, they pulled on nostalgia, and they talked complete rubbish. I got quite cross as a Canadian. In 1940, we fought alone against the Nazi domination, so we can do it again. I said, excuse me,
yeah,
how many Canadians were flying for RAF Bomber Command? How many ships were crossing the Atlantic and being sunk, by the way? But how
yeah.
many Australians were there? How many Indians were there? But it was something that really was effective. And unfortunately, the movie Dunkirk came out just before the vote. And I don't know if you saw it. It's
Yeah.
historically muddled, to put it mildly. But there's this moment where one of the figures, I think it's played by Kenneth Branagh, a naval officer, looks out and someone says, "What are we going to do now?" And he said, "We'll fight on alone." And it's in theaters around England, people got up and cheered. They're now regretting it. I mean, all that nostalgia hasn't amounted to, a glorious new
Right.
Elizabethan age or whatever. But I try and understand why the use of history has become so pervasive. I mean, my rough assumption is that it's because we've lost faith in other sorts of authority. The contempt in which politicians are held, the contempt in which journalists are held, the contempt in which other sorts of authorities are held, organized religion. I'd want to find much more about that. I mean, there must be sociologists working on it, and there are probably historians working on it. What is it that has given history such power, and why are we seeing it used more and more?
A lot of it has to do, I think, with the history as identity, which is another chapter title, I think, to your book, and the role that it plays in our personal identity, our group identity, our national identity. And if you look at Republicans in America, for instance, like Make America Great Again, it's all tied to history and like this feeling of something we have lost from the past
Yes.
that made us great at one point, and we are not that anymore because of A, B, C, D, E. And usually it allows victimization to come in to some extent, which fits well with the politicians. And I think it's easier to disseminate now in little snippets via social media and things like that, and like the rise of podcasts like also as a medium that folks can listen to. And because history's malleable, Joe Rogan has millions of listeners every week, but he has a very fuzzy relationship with historical truth.
It is really worth exploring. I mean, I wonder how much it's tied up with it's okay to admit hurt and sensitivities that, people used to keep stiff upper lips and you didn't talk much about what had gone wrong in your life. And now it's become, that you mentioned victims. I mean, that people are defining themselves through self-identified pathologies. I suffer from anxiety. I suffer from this. I mean, the medicalization of ordinary life, whether it's somehow tied in with this notion that, I can't help what's happened to me, but if I go back, I can find someone to blame or something to blame. I'm only speculating and I'm probably wrong, but it would be interesting to just think about it a bit more and why is it? And personal genealogies are now so important. I mean, they always were, but this passion people have for tracing their great, 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 great grandmother. But there is this interest in where our ancestors came from. I mean, my ancestors came from Scotland. Do I really want to know? I mean, I'm never going to find out much about them. Occasionally, I drink a bit of scotch and I don't mind haggis, but it's not something that consumes me. But a lot of people are really fascinated by where they came from. And whether this feeds into the power of history, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, all the more so because it does have an effect on today, not only politically, but also in the realm of foreign affairs as well. When people are using this history to identify in some way, shape, or form as either an ethnic group or a political group or whatever, it's having an effect. And trying to understand why and how that's being used matters.
I think a lot of it is being used by political leaders. The curious thing in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, was that as they did censuses over the years while it was still a communist state, more and more people were describing themselves as Yugoslav rather than Croat or Serb or Slovenian. And there were more and more intermarriages. But then that all fell apart, and a lot of it was the work of people who wanted to use it to split society up. And the same thing, I mean, in England, when they do a census, they have all these different categories, which are so out of date. And again, there's more and more intermarriage as there is in the United States. So, what is your ethnicity? You know,
Right.
if you're a Scot who marries someone from the Philippines, what's your ethnicity?
So we're running short on time, and I don't want to get you out of here before I ask about your recent foreign affairs article. We've talked about the different ways history's used, but you can also use history as a way to comprehend the age you're in now and what's happening in the world today. So you talk a little bit about that in your recent foreign affairs article about challenges to the international order today, not only just with Trump, but right wing populist movements in a number of different countries today. Obviously, you've written on World War I extensively and great power relations between leaders with Nixon and Mao and these different types of studies that you've done. But what have you been able to learn about our current world through your historical research?
I think what I'm becoming more aware of, perhaps is what's happening, is the power of example. That if someone gets away with something, and it's a bit like that old broken windows theory of crime, that if you don't repair the broken windows, then others will come and throw bricks through the windows that aren't broken. And I do think the power of example is important. I mean, before the First World War, there was a general understanding that the Ottoman Empire would be left to limp along and possibly even revitalize itself. And then Italy suddenly seized what became Libya. And that broke a norm that you didn't just go and attack without provocation. And I think the same thing before the Second World War, when Hitler marched troops into Austria, or when, of course, he took over what was left of Czechoslovakia. And it encouraged others. I think the power of example is something we perhaps have underestimated. That we had an international order where it just wasn't done to seize territory by force and to be able to have a legal claim to it. Well, that's gone, and no one seems to have paid a penalty. Well, Russia has paid a penalty, but not in the way that it's going to be forced to give up parts of what it's taken. More and more, it looks like it'll keep large parts of eastern Ukraine. It will almost certainly keep Crimea, and so that, I think, is what I'm thinking more and more. And I've come back again, and we can all be criticized for it, but I do think who's in power in a particular time in a particular place can make a real difference. And of course, there are forces in society. Of course, that person is shaped by those forces in society and has certain constraints on what he or she can do. But nevertheless, I think that without Hitler, I don't think you would have had the Second World War, and you wouldn't have had it continue as long as it did. And I think without Stalin, as I mentioned in my article, as Stephen Kotkin has said, you
Yeah.
wouldn't have had the push for collectivization. I don't think you would have had the horrors in China under Maoism, the Great Leap Forward, the appropriation of the landlords before that, the Cultural Revolution without Mao. None of his colleagues, as far as I can see, wanted it, and if they tried to resist, they were removed. And Stalin's colleagues just went along with him, or again, they were removed, usually shot or assassinated in some other way. And so I do think that you have to take into account the particular individual, if that particular individual has great power. And I think we're realizing that yet again in our world. I think a different president of the United States would be treating allies in a different way, would not be quite so unpredictable. Of course, people are unpredictable, but I think President Trump is a phenomenon. And it's very hard to think of another US president like him. He's not in a tradition of US presidents, even Nixon, whom he's been compared to.
Yeah, the madmen theory.
The madman theory. But, Nixon did recognize certain constraints and was, I think, aware that the world was a dangerous place, and I think wanted to make it safer for Americans, but also I think wanted to prevent a nuclear war. I don't know enough about President Trump's thinking, but I'm not reassured by what I've seen so far. Does he understand the world with which he's dealing? And does he have any sense that actions he takes might leave an impression, might leave a legacy that he doesn't want, which won't help the United States?
Yeah, interesting times, that's for sure, with regard to President Trump and decision making. But your point on example, I think, is an important one. And, it remains to be seen whether or not Russia breaking those norms of the past 75 years will lead to certain things that we've seen in the past that you had just described. But I will say, I don't know if you saw it, but The Economist made that exact argument in last week's edition in talking about Russia's example and the breaking of norms and how it's being used by folks like Kagame in Rwanda
Yeah.
and what he's doing in the DRC
Yeah.
and everything. So interesting that you brought that up. Well, listen, Margaret MacMillan, this has been wonderful. I appreciate everything you've done for the history field and your books in the past. I've read almost all of them and have read Dangerous Games probably 17
Good
times
Lord.
before. But thanks for joining us, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks for being so nice about my book. You've probably read it more than I have. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks once again to Margaret MacMillan for her time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.